Hello and welcome. In recent months, Arlington has suffered several more painful and publicized deaths and losses of beloved teachers and beloved students. And that has prompted us at Arlington Public News to want to have a fuller discussion, a follow-up discussion really, and conversation from something that we did a couple of years ago in coming here to the children's room to speak with the staff here. The Children's Room is an invaluable resource in Arlington for grieving families and children. And we are here to talk today with the Education Director, Deborah Rivlin, with whom we will have a conversation which is basically about how to talk about how to deal with bad things that happen and trauma in our lives. So Deborah, thank you so much for welcoming us here today. I wanted to talk, as I said, it's going to be a comprehensive conversation about this issue. And my sense is that there are basically, our lives are formed by concentric circles of relationships, starting from those closest and moving out from there. A couple of years ago, as I already mentioned, news producer Peter Bermudez was here to talk to your executive director, Donna Smith-Scharf, in the wake of another tragedy here in Arlington, about how to talk to kids about this. And something that she said at that time really stuck with me. She said that it was important to reframe the idea of protecting children, to have that be, that the best means for doing so would be to provide, as she put it, honest, accurate, age-appropriate information. So I'd like to start there and just ask you to flesh out a little bit more. What does that mean, and how does that happen?
Obviously, when something really sad happens, we wish that young children didn't have to know about those things, or that bad things didn't happen. And I often say I wish we could talk about how to prevent bad things from happening, but as we know that's not possible. And so how best can we help children and ourselves develop and strengthen coping skills around those difficult times and losses? And what you mentioned about being truthful is so important, because it's really the foundation of building trust. And I often say, how many people have overheard adults talking about something kids weren't supposed to hear about? And most of the time adults say, oh yeah, I've heard that. And is there really such a thing as a secret that it isn't going to come out, even if it's something very sad that happened? And most of the time people say no, kids are going to hear about it. And they
especially
do.
there are more means than ever, right?
More means than ever,
themselves.
From another friend, from the television, from overhearing, from
Social
so many
media.
ways. So in protecting, I like to reframe the word protection, is we don't protect by not giving information to children, because it's not a matter, are they going to hear it? The question really is, who do you want them to hear it from? And we say the trusted adults in their lives, their parents, their teachers, people in their lives, so that we can clear up misconceptions and misinformation. And so it is beginning with the simplest basic truth. Doesn't mean you give every detail. It's based on developmentally, where a child is and how much information you would give. But so the way I like to say it is, you don't have to tell everything, but you don't want to change the story. You don't want to, say, oh, it was an accident, when in fact if it wasn't, and you have to go back, because we want to build a solid foundation of trust.
So you really want to start with the truth, as you said it.
Exactly.
But you want to frame that in such a way as to not give information that is...
What do they need to know?
Mm-hmm.
What are they asking you? So sometimes I think adults give way too much. We have to remember young children are very concrete and literal thinkers, not abstract. So speaking abstractly to them would be, they wouldn't get it. So, but it's hard. And I think that we often think, oh, we can talk about this, but we can't talk about that. And there's a lot of judgments. And we want to be able to say that there's nothing that you can't talk about with me, your parent, your trusted adult. I like to it's either Mr. Rogers or Rabbi Grolman who said, if it's mentionable, it's manageable. That which we can talk about, we can do something about.
I'm struck also by one of the descriptors in what Donna said, and that is age appropriate, because I know that you deal with children of all ages here. And I imagine that what is age appropriate for a very young child versus a preteen versus an adolescent or a teenager, that all those are different. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about what kinds of things or information or ways of framing things are appropriate for those different age groups.
Sure. Well, very young children, it's not till about the age of 9 or 10 that they have abstract thinking, like I said. So for children under that age, you want to be as concrete and literal as possible, providing the basic kind of information. Also, very young children are very egocentric, and so that what happens in the world revolves around them. So you want to be sure that they're not taking responsibility for things, and that's why it's important to be able to clear up misconceptions and information. And I often say that whatever the age, whether we're 3 or 103, if we have a gap in information of what happened, we want to know, we fill it in.
Right, we're going to fill it in
and we don't
ourselves.
want, and young children to fill it in with their imagination, which is usually much worse than reality. Not just young children, all of us, when we have to fill that in. Children till about the age of 5 or 6 don't really understand permanence. So it's not unusual for them, it makes total sense to say, I know they died and they're not coming back, but they would never miss my birthday. That's sort of
right.
Together. I think it's very important that we use the words like, not euphemisms, like lost. So if you say to a young child, we lost Uncle David, what does that mean to them?
Right. They're thinking very literally.
Literally, like, can we go and find him? Or why is everybody crying and not looking for him? So we want to be able to use words like die and death, and having a definition of what does it mean. I like to say usually people live to be very, 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 very old, and really distancing for kids what that means. Sometimes there's accidents, like what happened to, and then you can say what happened, and always then say what was done, even though 911 was called, even though the doctors did their very best, their body stopped working and they died. Sometimes there's illnesses, like what happened to. And again, you want to distance if it's an illness. I would never say it as they died because they had cancer. I wouldn't say it that way. I've never lied to a child, nor would I ever. But that could be very alarming, because many, many people who have cancer don't die. They can live to 102. So we want to distance again. They were very, 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 very sick with cancer. So it's a different, helping them to understand that. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's violence, and violence is never, ever, ever, ever okay way to deal with any problems. So we need to say usually those things don't happen. Sometimes they do. And when you die, you don't come alive again, but we always have memories. And memories is something we can always talk about the person. Then that's for, like, if we were working in a public school or with friends, we don't tell them what our belief system is. We let children talk about what their belief system is. But as a family, then you can say, in our family, we believe. Mm-hmm. So that's, with certainly with very, with young children, and keeping it simple, knowing that young children are going to ask the same questions over and over and over and over again. It's not that they're not hearing you, they're trying to gain mastery over what does this mean. Because they don't understand permanence, the very young ones, they will, be looking, they may not, sometimes parents go, why, they don't seem sad enough. Or grief is very sporadic. With young kids, you may literally see, oh, that's really sad. Oh, are we having spaghetti for dinner? And it's at such a fast turn. That's normal for kids. That's normal.
And probably
grief.
Jarring for the adults around.
Yes, exactly. Or when kids ask the same questions over and it's very difficult. But I think kids being included instead of excluded really helps children. So helping prepare if you're going to go with a young child to see somebody in the hospital. Just like actually for us adults, we would picture somebody just the way we last saw them. And sometimes even as an adult, we're, taken back if they look different. And certainly for kids, you would want to prepare them what they're going to see or what they're going to experience. As kids get older, when kids around 6, 7, 8, they begin to understand that when you die, it's forever, but they don't really see it happening to everybody. They worry about their own safety, or about, sometimes we'll say, this, go wash your hands, you don't want to catch the flu. Well, why should they know that they can't catch diabetes or a heart attack or cancer? So we have to say, this isn't something you can catch. They're very, interested in kind of that. And they try to distance themselves from the person who died. So you may hear a child, for example, say, well, he always wore a blue cap to school every day. I don't wear a blue cap, trying to separate. And it's also that age, I say, they sometimes ask the gross and grubby questions, like, what makes the body cold, and where was there a lot of blood, and where was the blood, and things like that. Again, that can be really difficult if you're bereaved, but totally normal developmentally for children. Around age 9, and 10 is when abstract thinking comes in, so that they, of course, know that when you die, it's forever, and everyone dies, it's universal. But they tend to have their intellectual thoughts more available than their feelings. It's a way that they stay safe. So sometimes people think, wow, they're very cold how they're acting. What's wrong with them? So I remember when there had been, a mom called me and said, I'm very worried about my 11-year-old daughter. Something's wrong with her. My friend died from suicide, and by suicide. And when my daughter asked me how, I said it was very sad. She took an overdose of pills, and she said, my daughter said, well, at least it wasn't too messy. So it wasn't that she wasn't feeling tremendous inside, but that kind of the way that it's coming out, how do I not have the big highs and the big lows, their life calm. So sometimes they appear cold and crass, but what I want to say to all parents and teachers working with this age, don't think of them that's what they're feeling inside. So sometimes I say about this age, they're like, the duck on the lake that appears one way, but what's happening under the water, their feet are going, so we have to really be careful about not judging and being open.
I know we've yet to talk about preteen and teen years, but what you're saying does kind of bring to mind for me the fact that you must spend a certain amount of time really counseling the adults as well in all of these situations, because as you say, they are not only dealing with their own bereavement, but they are looking for signs in their children that maybe those children are not going to be giving them, or giving them different ones than what they might expect or project from their own. And very important to understand that that's all okay. Exactly,
and it's about having the tools, I often say, of language and strategies, and having education and understanding what does grief look like in children. Like I said, the sporadicness of grief is very common in children, and
right.
That we all grieve differently. But I think sometimes when we go back to that protection thing, when parents don't want to talk about it, I found it's because they didn't have the tools to know, what do I say? Or what if I say the wrong thing? So I totally agree with you. That's my,
and I think
big push. We need to educate.
Right, because I think very few adults, parents or otherwise, they wouldn't be out there getting the training in anticipation of these kinds of events a lot of the time.
We don't like
so
to
they
be
don't
proactive.
Really, yeah, that's a tough one. But anyway, I know that we also wanted to talk about other stages of youth and how this impacts.
Right. So that when they begin to have that abstract thinking, that is an age that you want to be able to, talk with them about what they're, especially if it's a peer group becomes very important. Talk with them about, their feelings, what can they do, what would they like to do in honor of the person who died or in memory of the person who died, really getting them kind of involved in that. And again, you may see in that pre-adolescent age a little bit different because of how they're appearing, whereas in adolescence you will see extreme highs and extreme lows, and death of a friend shatters their sense of immortality and invincibility. So although teens look like adults, they really don't have that adult thinking. And now because of all the research and all the and the brain, we know that in fact adolescence probably goes to about 24 or 25 until your frontal lobe is totally developed, which is our problem solving and thinking part of our brain. So sometimes with adolescents we go, what are you thinking? And it is the highest risk-taking age, which is why it's very difficult for parents of adolescents, because they don't think it's going to happen to them or anybody they know. Mm-hmm. And even if there was a teen and they had been drinking and driving, they'll say, like, how could this have happened? Or I've heard of teens say, oh, well, when I drink, I eat something. They probably didn't eat something, and this just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to them. Mm-hmm. At the same time, they really, having what's life going to be like without this person that, very, very, it's a time that you can philosophize and can ask their opinions on what are they thinking and get them involved in commemoration and all of those things, I think, are to make a difference, mm-hmm. That was important, that person was important to me. In all of the ages, I think we can't make assumptions in who any kind of loss ever affects, because your metaphor of the concentric circles, if you throw a pebble in and it just keeps going out and out and out, and we don't know with children. So sometimes in a school there may be a death and we think, there's assumptions made, well, they weren't good friends with that person, so that's not affecting them, when in fact that isn't true. As a matter of fact, we as adults, the kids who weren't friends, who really might not have liked the person who died, for example, they're just as much at risk as somebody who was very close with them because of other reasons. Mm-hmm. Or a child may just be because that they were the same age, or they may have a similar thing they're going through. So I think it's really important that we adults in schools, and why I believe it's important that we don't say whoever's having trouble, come down to this room, mm-hmm. because I think we're going to miss the majority of people who really want to, for lots of reasons, but really to look at more as a public health way, that we would have everybody told the information and everybody have a chance to hear whether they knew the person or not.
Okay, so one of the very concrete things it sounds like you're saying is the way for a school or a group or organization perhaps to deal with such a thing is really to spread the net in terms of information as widely as possible, not ask people to self-identify.
Exactly. And giving the opportunity for people to talk about what's happening and learn some basic, again, developing and strengthening healthy coping skills. So I think it's an opportunity if you didn't know somebody and you weren't close, but yet you're learning about that. This is what we do in a school community or in our church community or whatever. This is what we do in our family, that we help somebody, that we hear the information, that we can ask questions, that we're not in there alone, but we're in this together. And that's the other message that I like to say to anybody who's involved with kids, is that our message is that there's nothing too sad or too terrible to talk about with me. Nothing. We're in this together. And I think I think it's a really important message, because often when something really sad has happened, we think let's not talk about this, let's put it away. But what again are the kids thinking about? And I think children know who they can talk to, mm-hmm. and I think that to make that in the schools, in the family, in whatever our community, that this is an opportunity we can come together even in the saddest of times.
You were saying that children know who to talk to. I'm just thinking that one of those next concentric circles, clearly, once you get beyond children and their families, would be neighbors, friends, teachers, advisors, as you said before, trusted adults. In a situation, where something bad happens and you're dealing with, let's say, teenagers, how does an adult, if you are an adult in that situation and you are one of those neighbor, somebody who has regular contact with this child, but not necessarily have you ever had heart to hearts etc. Is there a good or bad way to approach providing support for that child? Do you let the child, him or herself, dictate
So one of the things, if, for example, if they were in a school that I say is a really in a good way, for whether it's a child or a teacher or faculty member, we don't ever, it's very unique of what somebody wants. So I think it's important to find out, how can we support you? What would be best for you? And not making assumptions again. So it might be that you're somebody who doesn't mind if somebody goes up and approaches or says, asks questions. Or it might be that you come to school and you don't want anybody asking you those questions. I think it's finding out what is support. And I say this too, if something has happened in the community, not to make assumptions of what people need, but find out what is true support, because true support is giving the person what they need, not what you think they need.
Mm-hmm. What if the person doesn't know what he or she needs?
Absolutely, and that's why we as adults would say we want to be here to support what you need. And if they go, I don't know, then you start giving some suggestions. Would you like us to let, is there anything you would like the class to know before you came back? So then you could say, I talked to Susie. Susie's coming back on Tuesday. In order to really be supportive to her, she said, it would be helpful if you didn't ask her a lot of questions. She appreciates your care, support. So you may, yes, as the adults, we may have to say, here are some things, what do you think would be helpful to you? Mm-hmm. And it can change. And if it changes, I think in a high school or an elementary school, for coming back, somebody, a guidance counselor, a social worker, or a teacher, somebody who, nurse, somebody who the child knows that they can go and have a few minutes of respite. Sometimes it's going down to the nurse's office, but maybe approaching, not in front of everybody, but individually, I want to help if in fact they needed to have some time that they, it feels too overwhelming. Mm-hmm. Concentration and focus, for example, is really hard for all of us, and coming back. So just trying to let them know that but engaging them, not saying this is what we're doing for you, without finding out what it is, and that it can always change, because you're right, even as adults we don't always know what that is.
Right, but you want to include them within that realm of whatever decisions, small or large, are right, going to be made. Make sure that they feel part of that.
It's always if you have something that you want to share with somebody, that they touched your life in some way, or that person in their life touched, always being able to write a card, to write that down, send that. I would say nobody ever tires of hearing a story about their loved one. I think more people have said what's really hard is when nobody acknowledges the loss. So it's not that you would stop and start saying, so how are you feeling, what's happening, of course but just to say, I'm thinking of you, and acknowledge, that, your daughter meant so much to me. She did this. I don't know if you ever knew, but when I was having a hard time, this. Mm-hmm. Nobody, that's never going to be something that...
It's never a bad idea.
Right, it's never a bad idea. And people all the time say to me, I don't know what to say when I see a family, or I see somebody that I'm so sad. And I go, if you share a memory, you're never going to go wrong. Because people want to hear a mother knows her child as a mother, but not as a friend or the colleague. And so we all have a lot of stories about people that the family might not know, and how wonderful that is to hear.
Yes.
And that their name isn't forgotten. So we don't want to take somebody who's grieving and sort of make them a pariah, that we walk around a different way because we don't know what to say. And I think, again, it's not that people are mean or have ill intention. It's out of nervousness. I don't know what to say. Mm-hmm. And sometimes just saying there are no words is what it is. My heart's with you. Being there for the long haul. Often people after a death or any kind of loss are there right away. I call it the full freezer syndrome. There's a lot of, everybody's doing something. And then what happens is, for the family, it continues, but everybody goes on with their life. So being there for the long haul, writing those notes, bringing something over 3 months, 6 months, a year later, really makes a big difference. So I think we in the schools, we as friends, to be there for somebody for the long haul, not just the short haul, makes a huge difference.
Yeah, in fact, you've hit really on something that is broadly applicable to life in general and relationships, healthy relationships with others, is being there for the long haul, as you say. Yeah. Lots of short-term support, but it's very important to be loyal, to be reliable, to be present.
We don't all have to be there in the first week, and that's what sometimes it feels that way. Mm-hmm. But in fact, even sending those notes or, making that your wonderful chili and saying, just was thinking of you, put it in the freezer if you don't need it now. How much that means to people.
For teachers and non-professionals, non-mental health professionals, but who are nonetheless, maybe a neighbor, nonetheless potentially an important person to help a child or somebody else through this process. What are guidelines that somebody like that might be able to use to understand when they are out of their depth, when they can't provide the support that this person needs and they need to guide them somewhere else?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we can do around the tools and language, and you're right, we don't have those, and certainly in Arlington, they offered, for example, a parent evening for people to come and to be able to talk and ask questions, and it was an opportunity, so that that's something that can be, anybody could come to, that you don't have to be a mental health professional. And certainly helping teachers with language and because they have the relationship, why it's so important. So we can do those kind of things, hopefully proactively, like you were saying, just so you have tools, or if something has happened. Definitely, if your gut says this person needs more, it's actually something they could call the children's room. We can help with referrals to individual therapists, as a matter of fact. But yeah, of saying, I think that maybe, that there's something going on and needs more. I say if it gets in the, normal grief has all of the things that feel, I can't eat, I can't sleep, I can't, I'm overwhelmed, my thoughts of focus and control. But if it gets severe, long-lasting, and getting in the way of life, it's always better to err on the side to go talk to a mental health professional to find maybe that there's, again, tools and strategies that can be helping that person with what's going on. Or I found sometimes when somebody's feeling really stuck, there's something that they're not understanding, or there's a place that's stuck that they're not able to, grieve in the way or express what they want to. They haven't had the opportunity, or there's stuff they don't know, so that we can help. A mental health professional could certainly help with finding out what is it that they need and what are some of the strategies for that. If there's been a trauma, seeing somebody who's a trauma specialist, a therapist, I think is really important, and there's wonderful techniques to help around that. So I think we need, to take, it's not a bad thing to need mental health professional care.
Certainly appropriate in these kinds of circumstances.
And if that doesn't mean that you're a weak person or anything, it's really, to me, it's all about helping gain those strategies. The good news is whatever children, no matter how young they are, learn now, or as an adult we learn now strategies, we take those with us throughout our whole lifetime. So when there's another loss, if something has helped us, we go back to that really helped. Let me do it this way.
Wow, that's an encouraging thing, because, you do worry about whether if the lessons that you can learn through simply navigating a time of trauma and loss, whether those will be available to you sometime hence.
Exactly. What helped you when that happened in the past? That's a good place to start, or what wasn't helpful. And I always like to say healthy coping skills, because there's certainly unhealthy coping skills as well. So we want to be sure that we're helping with finding those healthy coping skills. Getting people active and involved, I think, is a wonderful way. Giving back, doing something in that person's name to keep their legacy alive, making a difference, whether if it, going and trying to change legislation around gun control, if that, if that's something that's affected you, but becoming active. Even the youngest child could go on a walk, for the Jimmy Fund walk. They may not be able to walk all those miles, but they could walk a few blocks. And I remember even my own daughter, when we went on looking around and saying, wow, look at all the people who care. That's a wonderful thing. Having even the youngest child make a card for family, or bake cookies to bring over. Those are things that are, if you think of what's taken away, power and control when we've had loss, anything to give back a sense of empowerment and back a sense of control, again, no matter we're 3 or 103, that's appropriate. What is something that I can do that could be helpful at this time?
Yeah, and that really, what you're saying there really resonates for me also, in that I know that participating in some fundraising events, walks and other things for Samaritans, for instance, and a group that is a suicide prevention and bereavement group, that in those walks I met people, so many children who, young children who were clearly there because it was a way to do something. They weren't quite sure how to handle all this, and this was helpful in some small way, at least.
And I'm walking for that person who I loved, who meant something to me, and their name is going to stay with us. At the Children's Room in Arlington, we have a walk that's coming up in October, and you can sponsor and put a name of the person who you're walking for, and we actually walk with everybody's name on the back of our shirt, so that collectively, and then on the front of the shirt they can write the person they're specifically here walking, but we all walk with everybody's names of here are the people that we're remembering. And it's very powerful. It's a short walk from in Arlington, just I think it's the town hall it starts, and coming around to park, and everybody in the community is invited for that. You don't have to be coming to the Children's Room to do that.
I'm struck by the fact that in talking about children and how to support them through events such as these, we've been talking mostly about if the event happens outside of that child's experience, and then he or she hears about it, and then what we can do to help support, communicate with them, etc. But what happens in those instances where a child of whatever age is actually implicated? Perhaps a driver or a passenger in a car, another guest at a party. How do we help them to deal with those added burdens of guilt and sense of responsibility and things like that?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we separate a bad person from making a really bad choice. So even for an adolescent who's made a really, really bad choice and was drinking and got in a car and somebody got hurt, they weren't a bad person, they made a really bad choice, and we need to be able to openly talk about that. The truth is there's nobody who hasn't made a bad choice in their life, and not necessarily drinking and driving, but how many people have driven when they've been tired, or you walk across the street and you don't look, and most of the time we luck out and bad things don't happen, and sometimes they do. And I think it's about opening up. If I was in a school and that had happened, and we need to open up that conversation so the person who is already feeling terrible, it's very different than somebody who intentionally wants to hurt somebody, but opening that up about, they made a really bad choice, and bad choices lead to really difficult and bad consequences, and opening up that conversation. I also think it's really important for somebody who's feeling that tremendous guilt and feeling having responsibility, that they get some help, mental health professional, because it's really important for them. Because what we don't want to do is to have then another tragedy where the person feels that everybody's against them, And sometimes, especially in a high school, when something like that happens, it also triggers our own wow, we had done that before and we were lucky it didn't happen. And so that person gets blamed. Or, and I remember being in a high school where there had been a suicide and everybody started blaming the girlfriend because she broke up with him. It's we can't let that go. That's an opportunity to talk about, you know, if that was true because she broke up with him, there'd be no high school, because if everybody died by suicide who had a breakup in a high school, there would be no high school. There would be so many people. Something else was going on, and that we need to talk about, so that that person's life wasn't destroyed, for example. So I think I think it's a very important conversations to have. And as adults, we can't let those things go on the side. Like, let's let them, he's guilty, and let that go, because there can be a lot of more severe consequences from that.
Right. And as you say, compounding the damage done by a single tragic event so that it could encompass or include or lead to more is right. Exactly what we want to avoid.
You know, if somebody intentionally goes to hurt somebody, that's different. They're a bad person and bad choice. But most of the time in these situations, there's nothing intentionally going on. It was a really stupid thing they did, or that we did even as adults. Again, I mean, we all have done things, and that we're just lucky that, because most of the time we do luck out.
Yeah.
So we need to it's the opportunity to talk about that. That's one of those, if it's mentionable, it's manageable.
I did want to return to that idea of the concentric circles and moving out beyond that circle of people with direct contact with those right at who are most affected by something bad that happens. Out to now folks that you have mentioned before, people, other students in the school who didn't necessarily know a student, or neighbors who had very little or anything, or people living in the town. What is assuming that you are a person like that and feel impacted, want to reach out, what are appropriate things there? You've mentioned writing a card, and are there other kinds of gestures
yeah. I mean, I think absolutely writing to a family. I mean, I can tell you for sure, because I've heard from families how touched they are by people who they never dreamed would reach out or to say something, or making a donation in someone's name because you were thinking about them. Doing I call random acts of kindness. It's a neighbor and it snowed. You don't have to knock on the door, would you like me to shovel your walk? Just shovel the walk. Or leave a little package just saying thinking of you, on the door, or doing, there's so many wonderful things that we could just do to be helpful. And there's nobody who doesn't want their loved one to be remembered in some kind of way. And again, we don't know whose life anybody touches. I think we would all be surprised by how many lives we've all touched that we never even know about. It may just, you had one conversation with somebody, you said something, and that person made a difference, in your life. So doing something to reach out, or if it was a student and, who they were talking about mental health issues and who died by suicide, and that's something that you feel passionate about, spreading the education, making, what can we do? I always say we need to ask the questions. If it was up to me in the school, how do we prevent this from happening again? This person's name, how can we prevent this from happening again? Open it up. I'd like to open it up to the teens and say, what do you think we could do about this? Empowering again.
Mm-hmm.
We need to acknowledge and validate all losses, never minimize or judge a loss, and don't make assumptions. I think that those are like the really key things, that this person who might be, you think, at the end of the concentric circle, because that's our judgment about it, may not be. We don't know.
To don't make judgments, what else would you add to that list of things that are just bad ideas, things not to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole judging thing and minimizing, in our society, we often minimize losses, on all ends, or if the teen, will say, oh, there was a breakup, that's, you'll get over that, instead of acknowledging, or somebody has a learning issue, or they didn't get on the team they wanted, or they've just been diagnosed with cancer. All of those are losses. And I often talk about, we don't want to do competitive grief. You think you've had a loss? Let me tell you about mine. But instead, being open-hearted to, that's really hard what you're going through. It's like we don't get to say, oh, well, that's, sorry, what you're going through is bad, but it's not as bad as this, And what's the worst loss that can happen is somebody, what they're going through. And that, so I think that if we can be more open with people and just validating those and being present, goes a long way, instead of shutting off or making those judgments and assumptions. I think those are the things that are not productive and shut people down. And if you're a kid who loves soccer and it's your passion and you just got cut from the team, that's a pretty big loss for you then, or people who move from another country and they lose their language, their home, their culture. That's a pretty big loss for them. So I think we just also have to cast the net of being open to all losses, and acknowledging and validating those.
Is there anything that you feel that we haven't had a chance to cover in the conversation that would be important for our audience to know?
I just wanted to just talk a little bit about the grief process, because I think that often people think grief is a linear process, that today's bad and it keeps getting easier and easier, when in fact it's a very jagged process. It's also a lifelong process. It's not, we don't have closure and we don't get over it, and time doesn't heal all wounds. We learn to integrate the loss into our lives, so it's never a closure, but we learn, how do we learn to live with it? And part of that is by helping to make meaning. All of us in our life will be triggered by past things that happen. So it might be a death has happened that we experienced in our past, and then another death happens now in our present, and it brings us back to that place. That's normal grief. It could be birthdays or anniversaries or milestones. Somebody's getting married or having a baby. And those triggers I call, we can plan for. What are we going to do on that date, that anniversary date, as a family? And instead of dreading it, we can actually come up with something as a family. What are we going to do on that day together? Are we going to go to the place where that person loved to eat dinner together and invite everybody? They loved going to, Walden Pond for a walk, so that's what we're going to do on that day. And what's really nice about that, when you do plan something, if it's something that's meaningful, it can be something you can do every year, and it becomes like a ritual. And ritual is really important in our lives and is very helpful in our lives. The other trigger that's much harder is when I call it being sideswiped. When you least expect it, the song comes on the radio and brings you back to that place, or you run into somebody who doesn't know the person in your life died, and they go, oh, how's so-and-so? Or people have shared you walking in the supermarket and seeing that box of pasta, and they're so overwhelmed, like, I didn't know that would bring it up. But those are all part of normal grief. And for kids, they can be triggered in school by hearing a story or somebody saying, go bring this home to your parents to sign. And they don't have a mom. We use a lot of language. There's things that for kids that bring up a lot of those things too, that we need to help them to, what would you like to do on that day, and help empower them, and both be aware of those sideswipe triggers.
It's hard to do much about the sideswipe triggers, but I think your point is an excellent one, and seems to me to follow the principle that you said right from the outset, which is the last thing you want to do is ignore or repress. You want to get things out in the open, keep that communication open, prepare yourself for that anniversary, as you said.
And children are so much more creative than us adults too. I have shared this story in some of my trainings before, but I was at a school where a little first grader had died, and the kids were talking about how they wanted to remember her, and she loved trees, so they wanted to plant a tree in her memory in the spring. And one little first grader had the idea that everybody should bring a cup of dirt from their house so they could all put the dirt around the tree. And that's so beautiful, you know. Engaging them. And that's also the part when we feel like we've done something, it also helps us in our grief and in our remembrance.
This is a very important topic and something that nobody gets a guarantee to escape in their lifetime. So really appreciate you taking the time to share your experience, your knowledge, your expertise with us and with our audience. I'm sure it will be helpful. One of the things that I'm taking away from this is that the very qualities that always enhance people's lives are particularly important at this time, and that's compassion, empathy, acts of generosity, and focusing on somebody else, on, as you said, no competitive grieving, but instead making yourself available to the person who's really, person or people, really experiencing
Don't
this
underestimate trauma. Just your presence and your care, and being able to listen. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this conversation. Really appreciate it. For Arlington Public News and here at the Children's Room with Deborah Rivlin, this is James Milan. Thanks for joining us.